the moment Britain never imagined it would see unfolded live on national television. King Charles III, sovereign of the United Kingdom, marched into Parliament and openly confronted Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Right there, in the heart of Westminster, in full view of MPs, reporters, and millions watching at home. The chamber fell silent as the monarch's voice cut across the hall. No script, no ceremony. No carefully written address vetted by advisors. Just raw, unfiltered words delivered by a king who had run out of patience. For a nation that prides itself on restraint, tradition, and quiet diplomacy, this was chaos in its purest form. Gasps echoed through the Commons. MPs looked around in disbelief, some scrambling to their feet, others frozen in their seats. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens shaking. And across Britain, living rooms erupted with stunned shouts as people realized what they were seeing. A king challenging his prime minister live. A prime minister trying to hold his ground against his sovereign. A nation's institutions cracking under the weight of a personal feud made public. This wasn't just another day in politics. This was the moment the monarchy and the government collided, tearing through centuries of constitutional convention. This was the night Britain watched its stability unravel before their eyes. The seeds of this confrontation had been planted long before that explosive moment. For months, whispers of tension between King Charles and Keir Starmer had swirled through Westminster. At first, it was brushed off as rumor, the usual palace versus politics friction that simmered behind closed doors. Every prime minister, after all, had their clashes with the monarch. But insiders knew this was different. Charles was not his mother. Queen Elizabeth II had perfected the art of silence, steering the monarchy through decades of storms by never allowing her personal feelings to spill into the public sphere. Charles, on the other hand, was restless, opinionated. He had spent his life preparing for the throne, watching the world change, feeling the weight of issues he cared about deeply, and unlike Elizabeth, he wasn't willing to bite his tongue indefinitely. Starmer, for his part, had risen to power with a lawyer's precision and a politician's instinct for control. He prided himself on discipline, authority, and order. He had rebuilt the Labour Party into a machine of strict messaging and sharp hierarchy, and he wasn't about to let the monarch, even the king, undermine him. The tension began quietly. A speech here, a remark there. Charles spoke passionately about climate policy, urging faster, deeper reforms. Starmer bristled, insisting the government was already moving at historic speed. Charles raised eyebrows by praising community leaders who opposed certain housing developments. Starmer fired back, warning against royal interference in democratic planning. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The king and the prime minister were circling each other, their visions of Britain colliding beneath the surface. At private audiences, the atmosphere grew icy. Palace aides described meetings where Charles lectured at length, his voice rising with frustration, while Starmer sat stiffly, lips pressed thin, refusing to yield an inch. Each walked away, convinced the other was out of touch, stubborn, even dangerous. The press caught whiffs of the conflict. Headlines whispered of tensions at the top. Columnists speculated about the monarchy's role under a Labour government, and political cartoons depicted Charles and Starmer locked in a tug-of-war over Britain's future. But no one, not the most seasoned journalist, not the sharpest insider, predicted just how violently the tension would break. That morning, Westminster had felt normal enough. The Prime Minister prepared for another heated session, fielding questions from the opposition and fending off heckles from all sides. The Commons was buzzing with the usual mix of energy and exhaustion. MPs filled the benches, aides lined the walls, cameras hung ready to capture the day's drama. And then, everything changed. Whispers rippled first, murmurs that the king was on his way. Some laughed it off. The monarch doesn't just drop in on Parliament. It wasn't done. It wasn't allowed. But the whispers turned into a flurry of texts, a rush of staffers darting in and out, and then the doors opened. King Charles entered. There was no pageantry, no formal procession. He walked quickly, his face set, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes didn't wander, didn't flicker with the usual warmth or pleasantries. They locked straight ahead, fixed on the Prime Minister. The chamber froze. MPs rose instinctively, some half bowing, others exchanging panicked glances. The Speaker's gavel hovered in the air, caught between protocol and disbelief. Keir Starmer stiffened at his bench, his jaw tightening as he realized what was about to happen. This was no ceremonial visit. This was no planned speech. The king had come to confront his Prime Minister, live, unfiltered, in the heart of British democracy. The air in the Commons was heavy, thicker than anyone could remember. The king did not belong here in this way, not walking directly into the chamber unannounced, not fixing his eyes on the Prime Minister as though he were a prosecutor marching toward a guilty man. Tradition shattered with every step Charles took, and the MPs knew it. They could feel history shifting beneath their feet. The speaker tried to speak, his voice stammering as he tapped the gavel. "Order! Order!" But his words were drowned by the gasp that erupted the moment Charles opened his mouth. "Mr. Prime Minister," Charles said, his voice firm and resonant, carrying easily across the chamber without the aid of microphones. It was not the soft, measured tone Britain had grown used to from him. It was raw, unmasked, sharpened by months of frustration. Keir Starmer rose slowly from the front bench. He did not bow. He did not smile. He simply stared, lips pressed into a tight line. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice low but steady, the edge unmistakable. Gasps echoed again. The tension snapped taut. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. The monarch was addressing the Prime Minister, not through formality, not through ceremony, but directly, pointedly, publicly. Charles took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes locked. "I have watched, I have listened, and I can no longer remain silent," he declared. "What you are doing to this country, to its people, to its traditions, to its very stability, cannot go unanswered." The chamber erupted into noise. Shouts from the Conservative benches, gasps from Labour MPs, murmurs of disbelief from all sides. The speaker banged the gavel furiously, but his cries of "order" were useless against the storm that had been unleashed. Starmer straightened, his voice rising above the din. "With respect, Your Majesty, this is Parliament. The government is accountable to the people, not to the Crown." The uproar grew louder. Some MPs shouted in support, others jeered, but all eyes stayed fixed on the two men at the center of the storm. Charles did not blink. His jaw tightened. "The people, Mr. Starmer, deserve honesty. They deserve leadership, and they deserve a Prime Minister who respects the fabric of this nation instead of tearing it apart for short-term gain." The weight of the words hit like a hammer. It was accusation dressed as truth, and for the first time in modern history, it was being delivered by a king, live, in front of the world. Starmer's face reddened, his hands gripping the bench before him. "You overstep, sir. This chamber is not yours to command. This government was elected. This leadership was chosen by the people. You are the sovereign, yes, but not the authority. Not here." The roar of MPs filled the chamber again. Some shouted for Charles to sit. Others screamed for Starmer to back down. The speaker looked pale, caught in a constitutional nightmare no rulebook had ever prepared him for. But Charles did not retreat. He stepped forward once more, his voice sharper now, his finger pointing toward the Prime Minister. "And what good is authority if it abandons the very people it claims to serve?" The room froze. The clash had gone beyond politics. It was now personal. Starmer's composure cracked. He slammed his hand against the bench, his voice cutting above the chamber. "This is unacceptable. You do not lecture this House. You do not dictate terms to an elected government." The Labour benches roared in approval, MPs pounding their desks, but Charles didn't flinch. He stood in the middle of the chamber, unmoving, commanding, his voice rising with a thunder no one expected from him. "I do not lecture," he shot back. "I speak because silence has failed. I speak because this nation, my nation, stands on the edge of crisis, and its so-called leadership looks the other way." The chamber dissolved into chaos. MPs shouted over one another, the speaker's desperate gavel pounding like gunfire. Conservative MPs jeered Starmer. Reform MPs shouted for Charles to continue. Labour MPs screamed for him to leave. It was bedlam, pure and unrestrained, echoing through the historic walls of Westminster. Starmer raised his hand, demanding silence. His face was red now, his voice raw with anger. "Enough! This is a democracy, not a throne room. I will not be intimidated by titles, I will not be undermined by crowns, and I will not allow this chamber to become a stage for royal interference." His words thundered, but Charles matched them without hesitation. He raised his chin, his voice cutting through the storm like steel through smoke. Then do not fear the crown, Prime Minister. Fear the truth. Because the truth has found you, and it has stripped you bare. Gasps erupted once again. The chamber erupted into a frenzy. Some MPs leapt to their feet, shouting for Starmer to answer. Others clapped, the sound echoing in sharp, chaotic bursts. Starmer's lips moved, but his words caught in his throat. For a flicker of a second, brief but fatal, he faltered. The cameras caught it. The nation saw it. The Prime Minister rattled, his control slipping, his authority punctured by the King's unflinching assault. Charles stood firm, his figure unyielding, his words ringing with finality. You may govern, but you will not command respect by shouting over failure. And tonight, in this chamber, the failure is yours. The silence that followed was electric. Starmer's mouth hung open, his hand frozen mid-gesture, his rebuttal dead before it began. The chamber sat in stunned disbelief. The storm momentarily muted. The King had spoken. The Prime Minister was silenced. And the cameras cut sharply to black, leaving the image hanging in the minds of millions. The monarch standing tall. The Prime Minister shaken, Parliament itself trembling under the weight of history. The silence that hung over the chamber after Charles's last words was deafening. For a space that thrived on noise, heckles, and jeers, the quiet was suffocating. MPs sat rigid, some gripping the edges of their benches, others whispering furiously into their colleagues' ears, but no one moved to break it. All eyes were on Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister stood at his bench, jaw set, fists clenched. His eyes locked on the King. He looked like a man who had just been cornered. Too proud to back down, too exposed to stand tall. Finally, he spoke. His voice was louder than before, almost shaking with the strain of holding his ground. You speak of failure, Your Majesty, he said, each word sharp. But failure is pretending that the crown speaks for the people. It does not, it cannot, it has no mandate, and it will not dictate the terms of this government. The Labour benches erupted in applause, MPs pounding the desks, shouting in defiance. Starmer's face flushed with determination, his voice rising further. I was elected, this House is elected, and it is here, not in Buckingham Palace, where the will of the people lives. You may wear the crown, but you do not carry the vote. And in this chamber, the vote is everything. The words hung heavy, triumphant in tone. But Charles didn't flinch. He stood rooted, his expression steady, his eyes unblinking. And then slowly, he moved forward. One deliberate step, then another, closing the distance until his presence filled the Prime Minister's sightline. When he spoke, his voice was low but cutting, the kind of tone that slices deeper than any shout. And yet, Mr. Starmer, when the people look at you, they do not see leadership. They see calculation. They see control. They see a man more interested in preserving his own image than in protecting the nation he swore to serve. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Starmer stiffened, his lips pressing together, but Charles pressed on. His voice grew louder, sharper, carrying across the hall with the weight of centuries behind it. You claim to speak for the people. Then tell me, Prime Minister, when did the people ask for empty promises? When did they ask for hesitation? When did they ask for a leader who cowers behind procedure instead of standing for principle? The words landed like blows. Starmer tried to cut in, his hand rising in protest. But Charles's voice thundered over him, silencing him before the rebuttal could form. You say this chamber holds the people's will. Then let it show it. Let it show whether it stands with truth or with timidity. Let it show whether its Prime Minister can withstand a single question without faltering. Charles leaned in, his eyes narrowing, his finger pointed toward Starmer like a dagger. The chamber leaned with him, the tension snapping taut. Answer me this, Mr. Starmer, Charles said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the uproar. What do you stand for, other than yourself? The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, cries from all sides. Some MPs pounded their benches in support, others jeered in outrage, but the sound was a storm without direction. The speaker's gavel cracked against the desk, his voice hoarse as he shouted, Order! Order! Into the chaos. But it was no use. All that mattered was the Prime Minister, and he was frozen. Starmer's mouth opened, but no words came. He blinked, his lips moving slightly, his hand gesturing weakly, but nothing followed. His face flushed deep red, his jaw trembled ever so slightly, and the silence stretched on. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly, capturing every second of the Prime Minister's faltering. The man who prided himself on discipline, control, and sharpness looked shaken, stripped bare in front of his own parliament. The king had delivered the question, and Starmer had no answer. The chamber dissolved into pandemonium. MPs shouted across the aisles, some standing on their feet, others slamming their fists on the benches. The roar was deafening, a cacophony of outrage, support, and disbelief. The speaker banged his gavel again and again, his face pale with panic, but the chamber had spiraled beyond his control. Charles stood unmoving in the center of the storm. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture wildly. He simply stood tall, his eyes locked on the Prime Minister, his presence enough to drown out the chaos around him. Starmer tried to recover. His lips moved, his chest heaved as he inhaled, but the words caught in his throat. Every attempt to form a rebuttal collapsed under the weight of the silence that had already condemned him. He looked left, then right, as if searching for support among his benches. But even his closest allies stared blankly ahead, unwilling to intervene. The cameras swung between the two men, the king steady and unflinching, the Prime Minister cornered and faltering. It was a picture of power, of vulnerability, of centuries of tension boiling over in a single, impossible moment. Finally, Charles broke the silence, his words deliberate and final. "Then there is nothing more to say." The chamber froze. The uproar cut short, the benches falling into stunned quiet. The king turned slightly, his cape brushing the floor as he stepped back, his face unreadable. Starmer remained at his bench, standing stiffly, his hands trembling ever so slightly against the wood, his lips pressed tight, his gaze fixed downward. He had no words, no comeback, no recovery. The image was complete. A monarch unshaken, a prime minister exposed, and then the cameras cut. The feed ended abruptly, leaving millions watching at home with one frozen image burned into memory. King Charles standing tall, Keir Starmer silenced, and the House of Commons engulfed in chaos.